Well, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jamie Jones, Business Development Manager for Yieldmaster Solutions. We have some really helpful and intriguing information to share with you today. This is being recorded, so if you'd like to go back and review some of the topics or even share it with someone else that might find it interesting and helpful, you'll be able to do so. Joining us today is Jake Anderle, Technical Agronomist representing Legend Seeds and Yieldmaster Solutions. So Jake, I'll kick it over to you to introduce yourself and dive right into some helpful alfalfa management tips.
Thanks, Jamie. So I'm Jake Anderle, sales agronomist, been with Legend for 10 years. So I live in Ellsworth, Wisconsin, kind of just across the river from the Twin Cities. Started with Legend as an account manager, transitioned into agronomist. So I kind of work so I cover Wisconsin, the eastern half of Minnesota, northeast Iowa, Michigan, a little bit into northern Illinois. So kind of cover a pretty wide geography. So with that, covering that wide geography this year, we were sitting talking about a little bit earlier here about rainfall, just the differences. So the one constant that most of the area at least in the upper Midwest, and of course across most of the U.S., is the winter of 2024 was probably one of the warmest years on record, or warmest winters on record, I should say. So kind of going into winter, we started off very dry. A lot of areas were drought stressed last summer, and then that kind of trickled into fall, which led into winter. So we were very mild. It kind of felt, and I was making the joke with a couple guys yesterday, actually, that we've had April for 4 months where I live. It kind of just we never really truly had a hard winter where it was, 10 below for 3 weeks. But what we did have is we had a lot of freezing and thawing cycles. So we had, just in general, we had a lot of weather where we went from, say, the teens and 20s for highs, and then the next week we were in the 60s, and then got slammed back into the freezer again. If you live further south, it was maybe you were in the 30s to the 70s, or, there was just a lot of temperature fluctuations. So that really kind of caused a little bit of concern for alfalfa. And then the biggest thing is when we had those temperature fluctuations, it wasn't a gradual descent down to 20 degrees. It was 60 to 20 in less than 48 hours. So very little to no frost in the soil, or in our ground, in most areas. Some of the extreme north did have a little bit, but it was by no means what we usually are used to seeing. So kind of widespread, and I know talking to Brian, who works for us out in North Dakota, they're seeing some winter injury up that way. In Wisconsin, I was thinking it was going to be a lot worse than it actually was, but there are some isolated pockets where, guys had stuff on south-facing hillsides or stuff that broke dormancy and then kind of froze off, and I'll talk about some of those things here. So alfalfa wintering. Alfalfa is a photo period sensitive crop. So similar to like soybeans on flowering, soybeans flowering date, the initiation, that's June 21st. Alfalfa is photo period sensitive, but on the back side, and it's more towards the dormancy side. So between the light and then when our average temperatures start to fall below 40 degrees for the daytime highs, alfalfa begins to go through its kind of dormancy or getting ready for dormancy. So kind of what happens in that process, or the first thing that's going to happen is you've heard guys talk about with alfalfa, it's really important to have the right amount of potassium. So what happens is our above ground tissue starts to essentially die off, especially when we really get those cold temperatures. And the plant will essentially fill itself with potassium and other sugars and make somewhat of an antifreeze. So alfalfa can tolerate temperatures, and this is ground temperatures, not air temperatures. So we're talking actual soil temps of 5 to 15 degrees, depending on how long it's that cold, So like obviously it can handle 15 degrees a little longer than it can handle 5 degrees. When you start to get soil temperatures below 5 degrees, any water that is left, so in that, if you look at that picture on the right, there's that big blue thing, and that's called the vacuole. It's kind of like what holds the water pressure of the cell. So what happens is that dehydrates down, and then the potassium and sugar mixtures are dumped in, or carbohydrates are dumped into that, and make the kind of that antifreeze. When you get below that 5 degree threshold, that's about all the lower in temperature that that antifreeze protects you for. And then what happens is when you get below 5 degrees, that water that is left crystallizes and ruptures the cell membrane, and then we start to deal with root rots and things like that. So that's not, we didn't really deal with that part of it this year. That was a big problem back in 2018, 2019. If you guys remember back to those, that was a pretty severe winter kill for most of the northern United States. Was pretty rough that year. Okay, so we talked about the cold side, and now kind of shifting gears a little bit, things that cause winter injury besides cold temps. So ice sheeting and water ponding, this was pretty limited just because of how dry we were up until, say, a week ago. So there really isn't a lot of this, but what happens when we get that ice sheeting effect is you prevent that air exchange from the crown, or essentially the living part of that alfalfa plant, up into the air. So what happens, the ice sheeting goes over the top, it cuts off that airflow, and so what happens is lactic acid, methanol, things like that build up in that root. Essentially, it's just like when you take a stress ball and you start squeezing a stress ball over and over and over. You might be able to do it for 30, 45 seconds, and over time your forearm starts to get tired and you can't go as fast. That's lactic acid buildup in your muscles. And the same thing happens in alfalfa, is that, over time it's struggling, it's going through anaerobic respiration. Eventually that root will die. So it can tolerate about 2 to 3 weeks of ice sheeting or water ponding, depending on how deep that water is and how long it's around. But before it's going to die off. So if you have a low spot in a field and it might be flooded for a day or two, and then the water disappears, and then a week later it's flooded a day or two, it handles that a lot better than being underwater for a straight week. Okay, so uncontrollable factors that affect that winter injury. So soil types and textures. So your more well-drained soil types are less prone to winter injury because excess water can get away. So we don't deal with the ice sheeting, the water ponding, those kind of things. This year, the next thing, the fall moisture status, those two kind of go hand in hand. So this year it's the flip side, right? We were extremely dry. So our lighter soil textures actually probably went into winter with alfalfa stands in a lot worse shape than our heavier soils. That doesn't happen too often. But fall moisture status, usually in general, you don't want to have saturated soils heading into the fall, because any excess moisture we do get through the winter that turns to water then becomes ice because the ground can't take it. And then snow cover. And this is one of the things that this year, the guys that are struggling with that have some spotty looking stands, snow acts as an insulator from both the cold temperatures on the top side, and then throughout the winter. And then also when we get those kind of 1 to 2 degree really cold, or 1 to 2 day really cold snaps in that early April timeframe where we can get down to 26, 28 degrees, it's actually better to have a snow if your alfalfa is broke dormancy to insulate it. This year, unfortunately, when we had that, we didn't have any snow cover. So the reason you need that snow cover throughout the middle of winter is that's what keeps the ground insulated, so we don't get soil temps below that 5-degree threshold. So at a minimum of 4 to 6 inches of snow, you start getting 16, 20, 24 inches of snow like we had the winter of 2022 going into 2023. Then it becomes more of the winter kill risk becomes more of ice sheeting, if you will, just because of all that excess water. Okay, so things you can control. Cutting management. So it doesn't matter if I'm in, so we say Western Wisconsin where I live, or if I go to Southern Iowa, or if I go to an alfalfa stand in Arizona. Most alfalfa stands can only take about 20 cuttings in their lifetime. So whether I'm in a 5-cut system in Wisconsin, or we got guys that are taking 8, 9 cuts a year on some non-dormants, things like that, it only tolerates about 20 cuttings. So the faster that cutting schedule, especially when you're further north and you push that cutting schedule, the more stress it puts on that stand. So and this is a big one. Stands harvested between September 1st and October 15th. This year we had a very mild, nice fall temperature wise. There was a lot of alfalfa that got cut around September 15th to 20th that guys like, I'm just going to take my one more cutting and it will take advantage of this weather. And those are the stands right now that I'm really seeing that are struggling, because what you do is that plant is preparing itself, or the start of it is preparing itself for winter. And then what happens? So it wants to put, it wants to put sugars and potassium down into that taproot. So if you think of like a pipe with a valve on it, its valve is going one way into putting in nutrients. And when you cut it, it's like turning that valve back the other way. Now we're not putting anything back into the savings account, if you will. We're drawing money out of it, or in this case, nutrients. And so it really puts a lot of stress on that plant. So that's the biggest mistake I see guys make on alfalfa that can have winter injury on it. Okay, one other quick thing. So stand age. So the older stands, obviously, the older stand is, the more likely it is to have some winter injury or be more at risk. And so this year, though, I would argue, at least in my area, guys that tried to seed alfalfa last summer, or that kind of that late July, early August time frame. Maybe they had some wheat acres or rye and they took it off and tried to seed. We just had zero moisture, and a lot of those didn't germinate until we had rain in late August, early September, and then we were drought stressed again after that. So those new seeding fields this year look pretty rough in some spots. Now there are some that look very good. This is the one exception to the year where I would say new stands look worse than the older stands do. And then the big one, soil pH and fertility levels. And on the agronomy side, not talking on the seed side or the biological side, it's just straight agronomy. Soil pH and fertility levels with alfalfa are extremely key. You can have the best variety of anything and the best fertility or the best, program, you will, for management, but if your soil pHs and everything are out of whack with alfalfa, it's not going to work. So having a pH at 6.5 as a minimum is the big thing. And if you look at that, so that chart on the right there, so soil acidity versus the fertilizer wasted. So this is taking into account N, P, and K, your three macros. So when you start getting soil pHs of a 5.5 to 6, we're wasting 20 to 30% of, or not wasting per se, but we're not having availability to those nutrients. So what happens with alfalfa is guys that are putting on a maintenance application of potassium to, just only do crop removal. Well, what you're actually putting down is not all available, and now you're starving that crop. And those are the fields, when we get in those low pH situations, I bet more often than not, those are fields that are going to have issues or that are going to need to be rotated out. So signs of a stand that has winter injury. So the picture on the left is actually a field that had a lot of kind of ice sheeting on it. So this, and it's not, I wouldn't say that it's not typical to see in a year like this, but what I'm seeing this year is if it's dead, it's all dead for the most part, from that freezing thawing. So, but what you'll see in general is it'll be slower to green up when you get warm temperatures. So most of the upper Midwest, and even as you go further south, we've had temps above 60, 65 degrees. Alfalfa has broke dormancy and is starting to grow. If you see fields out there, if you're seeing fields that just aren't doing anything yet, pretty well bet that there's some form of injury or winter kill there. So what happens when you see that slow to green up, usually you either have like snap taproots below the ground where they're actually broken, or you'll just have that ice sheeting effect where it almost looks like you sprayed the whole field with Roundup where everything is just completely dead. Now, this year, what we're seeing the winter kill, and I know like in North Dakota and Wisconsin, the big cause was that 60 degree to 20 degree to 60 degree to 20 degree. The alfalfa was breaking dormancy, and then a week later it was being forced back into dormancy. And so what happens is, once you, like I talked about, the taproot being a savings account, once you tap into that in the springtime, there is no opportunity to go back and replenish that. So if you essentially move those nutrients from below ground to above ground and we freeze that tissue off, those nutrients can't go back down to the taproot to help regenerate new growth again. Now we're starting, it's like if you've ever been stuck on a hill with a pickup and a trailer or something, you're on a muddy hill or something, you start going and you start sliding backwards. Well, guess what? It's not going to go any easier to get up that hill. So that's the struggles that we're seeing in general this year. And then root damage. So root damage and discoloration. The picture's not in here. That's okay. So that's the root discoloration is another thing you can look for. Those fields where you are seeing stuff not green up, I always recommend just take a longer spade shovel, pop those crowns out of the ground and cross section them. And you'll start to see if the inside of it's kind of turning a brown discolored and smells kind of funky, and you'll know if it's rotting. You'll know even they can green up and still have that, but you kind of know that sometimes if you take that first cutting off, that alfalfa is, going to be dead after that or very slow to recover. But that the knolls and dry knobs, things like that this year, there is a lot of root injury on those or a lot of rot. And those are spots that aren't greening up right now. So if I have winter damage, and this is a question I get about 5 times a week this time of year, what do I do if I have a stand that's not adequate, or if I know I've got a problem? How do you evaluate it? So best thing you can do is look at what's there rather than what's not there. So you can still have some winter damage in certain areas and little spots and still be okay. So alfalfa, to maintain top-notch tonnage, or your kind of 100% tonnage goal, is greater than 55 stems per square foot. So if you can hit 55 stems per square foot, or when you count after it greens up, and we're not looking at the actual root crowns or counting the actual stems coming out of those root crowns. So we could have 2 root crowns that make 60 stems, or you could have 10 root crowns that only make 55. Either way, you're still fine. It's not a plant count, it's a stem count. So when you slip below that 55, we start getting into that 40 to 55 range. Your tonnage is going to take a little bit of a hit, but it's still recommended to not rotate that stand out. You can still have very good tonnage all the way down to 40 stems per square foot. There is a little bit of a hit there, but it's not worth the cost of ripping that out and reseeding fields. And then when you get less than 40 stems per square foot, that's when the recommendation is to kind of rotate out. And we're talking pure 100% pure alfalfa stands. If you have an alfalfa grass mix and you only are hoping for 50% alfalfa, this number should get cut in half, if that makes sense. So, and the thing is, when you're looking at it, you might have a field where you've got a half-acre dead spot, and then it looks really good. And then you got another half-acre dead spot, and then you got a big patch that looks good. And so the biggest thing when you do those counts is to randomize it throughout the field. So what a lot of people do is they'll take an object, or you'll take some people make like a little alfalfa square, a 1 foot square, and close your eyes, turn on in a circle once or twice, and then randomly throw it out there, 10, 20 feet. And then wherever it falls, go count that and do that in multiple points in that field. And then take that whole average of that field, and if your whole average is coming up as 30 to 32, it's time to rotate. But if your whole average comes out to be 45, if you only look at that 1/2 acre dead spot, you might be, we got to rip the whole thing out on an 80-acre field. It's not cost prohibitive to do that. So that's kind of the main thing. The other thing, if you're in a hurry, or you got somebody that wants you to look at a stand, or you want to look at your own stands, a quick down and dirty method to tell if it's going to make it or not is if you go to the root crown and you slide your hand right along the base of it and squeeze. If it feels kind of like a carrot and kind of hard, like there's pressure there, it should be just fine. But if there's any give to the outside of that taproot, you can pretty well guarantee that's, even if it's greening up, if there's a lot of give there, it's going to either green up and stall out and die, or you're going to take a cutting and you're going to have big bare spots out in that field. So kind of dive into the next part of this. So 4 years ago, we've been using Invita on corn and soybeans. And kind of just real quick, what Invita is. So Invita is a nitrogen fixing biological. So it's made by a company called Azotic. And so we've been, Yield Master Solutions has been selling it, in corn, beans, sugar beet, potatoes, lots of different crops. So 4 years ago, we started experimenting with alfalfa. So Invita fixes nitrogen. It takes NO2 from the atmosphere and converts it into NH4, which is plant usable nitrogen. So a lot of people always challenge me. They're like, well, crops like alfalfa, or let's say we're talking soybeans, make their own nitrogen. How does this work? So all legumes, doesn't matter which one we're talking about, they all rely on rhizobia to inoculate their root system to make nitrogen. What we're finding in a lot of areas, especially like for instance on soybeans, is that nodulation is not enough to make up the nitrogen demand. So it's one of those things. We see a very good return in corn and soybeans, sugar beets. When we talk return on investment, usually we're looking for a 3, 4, maybe even 5 to 1 return on investment is considered very good. Invita foliar applied to alfalfa has been if we're looking just at straight protein. And so what it does is it increases the protein content of your haylage or your dry hay, whichever way you're taking it. It increases it by about 3.3%. That doesn't sound right off the rip. It doesn't sound like a really high number, but at 3.3% at current soybean meal prices, or they'd pick your poison on what you're putting into that ration for a protein supplement. it's about a 10-to-1 return on investment. But we've been experimenting and using Invita over the top of alfalfa for, this would be we're going on year 4 now. Okay, so application. So what you want to do is you want to apply it to the new growth after first cutting. So that's 3 to 5 days after harvesting, and that'd be for our more northern geographies where we can deal with, once our alfalfa greens up, we could still deal with a frost. If you're further south and you don't really have to worry about frost too much, you can apply it before first cutting. It's just that frost risk, if we kill that above ground plant tissue right when those plants start to green up, if that tissue on above the ground dies off, then Vita, essentially the bacteria count is too low or kind of dies off. So the worst thing that could happen is you go out and spray it. 2 days later, we have a really hard freeze, and then we kill that bacteria. So that's why we recommend after first cutting. In our northern geographies, and we're kind of out of the woods for a frost, hopefully. So what happens? So it gets a free ride in the tank. If you're spraying a fungicide or an insecticide, foliar feeding, it can be mixed with as far as I know, I haven't had a case yet, but all insecticides, herbicides, foliar feeding, whether we're talking a boron or a magnesium or manganese or anything like that. And the cool part with this is it's only a 1-time-a-year application. So with Invita, it'll colonize all over in the plant. So essentially it'll go anywhere where you have the ability to do photosynthesis. So it colonizes in root tissue, it colonizes in the above ground tissue. So even though when we remove it, when we cut that alfalfa, we're taking, say, 95% of the plant material off that field, there are still crown buds on that plant that are on the alfalfa that are dormant that Invita has colonized in. And it'll also regenerate from the taproot. So when it takes off again, there's bacteria that will translocate to those other kind of that newer growing tissue. So that then the concentration of that bacteria in that plant season long will get higher and higher and higher. So what we've seen when we talk protein, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the concentrations when we pull samples get higher and higher season long, the further out we get from that application. So and what it's doing, and I kind of talked about this, but it's supplementing that plant with more nitrogen. So nodulation on alfalfa has been, I would say, fair to horrible the last 2 to 3 years at least. We've had some pretty interesting springs, whether we were, last spring we had all that snow and all that water, and then all of a sudden it went right to dry, and we were kind of, begging for rain within 3 weeks. Those wide swings, it's not easy on plants, but it's also not easy on those bacteria, those rhizobia that those plants rely on for that nitrogen source. So our rhizobia levels have not been adequate enough. So if you're short nitrogen, you're also going to be short protein on the alfalfa side. Nitrogen is the main component of making amino acids or making protein. And if you think about, like say corn is a high nitrogen user. Nitrogen moves in through a plant through a process called mass flow. So you have to have a kind of a water pressure gradient, and then you also have to have surface area. Those are the kind of things that make that work well. Think of an alfalfa root. Not a lot of surface area at all per se compared to other crops, and it takes twice the nitrogen of a corn crop. So yes, it does make a lot of that on its own, but it is not, if it is short, it is not designed to pull it from the ground itself. So that's where Invita comes in and why we're seeing that big response. So, and what it's doing is it's only increasing the protein. I have not had very consistent data on the tonnage side where I can definitely say, yes, it's increasing tonnage by X. I have had farmers that tell me they think they get 1/10 of a ton of dry matter. I've had guys that tell me they get 1.5 tons of dry matter. But we're not seeing the consistency on the tonnage side like we are on the quality side. So this is our 2023 trial data that we had. So this is Invita applied over the top alfalfa. So this is 14 tests from 4 different counties, and I actually think it's 5 counties. So you'd be talking Pierce, St. Croix, Trempealeau, Jackson, and I actually think Wood or Clark. It's one of the 2 are on there too. It'd be Clark County, I believe. So these are second and third cutting tests that are in this data set. So we pulled some second, some were pulled third, some were pulled both. So the average increase on protein was 3.31%. So we took 22.7% average protein and increased it to essentially 26.01. With that, we also saw a big increase in relative feed value, or RFV, by 39.64 points. So the 3.3% in protein alone is not enough to get RFV to jump by almost 40 points. There's other factors in there as well. It makes up a good majority of it, but we have seen a little bit better fiber digestibility on some samples. A lot of the samples come back higher in sugar. So then we're taking it from essentially 184 out to feed value to 225 almost. So now the big one, or the big thing, the return on investment here. So in the dairy situation, average savings per head per day on this data set, if you figure a 50-50 diet in a dairy herd between corn silage and haylage, it's about 29 cents per head per day savings. And that's on figuring $400 a ton soybean meal. I know some areas of the country use canola, some use other things. So you kind of have to back figure that. I just use soybean meal is kind of the universal one in the upper Midwest that we use. So average return on investment with that data set was about 9 to 1. It's 8.9 to 1. So, we talk about like Invita on corn is about an 8 bushel response. It's been a very good product on corn. 8 bushel is still about a 3 to 4 to 1 return on investment. So we're talking double that kind of return. So this is just real brief. This is the data set. So this is the increase in protein. And if you look at some of those samples, I believe it's sample number 10. Sample number 10, if you look at that one, was almost an 8-point jump in protein. Sample 10 is a 6-year-old alfalfa stand. It's a very good stand of alfalfa still. The crowns actually look like oak trees out in the field. I mean, they're just these massive giant things, and there's only 1 or 2 per square foot, but we're still getting that 55 stems. So the older the stand, like I said, the higher that protein increase. And this data set's got everything in here from 2nd-year stand to 6-year stand. So they're kind of evenly spread out. So kind of just a large scope picture, if you will, that way. So this is on the crude protein. So this is the RFV increase. If you go back to number 10, if you look at that increase, so 8 points in protein is a lot, but it's 8 points in protein will not make up 90 points in RFV alone. Same thing, there was other things in that sample, and granted that is the high. So we take an average of 3.3. There are some in here that aren't that, or aren't that high. Just like to point that out, that's why that one is so high. The other thing to remember, just kind of throughout this whole thing, is these are all pure alfalfa stands. So I'll address kind of before I get into the milk side of it. So if you have a grass alfalfa stand mix, you will see a tonnage increase off of the grass hay component. We've seen about a 30% increase in tonnage on straight grass hay. So when you mix the two together, if you have a 50-50 grass alfalfa mix, you're going to get the protein content increase from the alfalfa, plus you're going to get the tonnage from the grass. Now, obviously, if you have less alfalfa in that mix, your protein in the whole overall mix is not going to be as high. We're not going to see 3.3 in a 50-50 mix, if that makes sense. But you will, a lot of those guys that put grasses in are looking for, either they're looking usually for more tonnage or just longevity, or maybe just not as high of quality either, depending on what you're feeding. So this is a kind of a feeding trial that was done. So this is sample number 13 in the data set that we just talked about. Not number 10, not the real high one. So this one wasn't that, the protein increase, I believe, was just over 2%. RFV was about 35. So what they did is, so they had, they went from non-treated, or essentially the untreated haylage, to Invita applied haylage was the only difference in this trial. Everything else stayed consistent. So what they did, so it was 35 cents per head per day is what the nutritionist that did this kind of found with that. So not only our data showed 29 cents is what we figured. Going through the cow, he was at 35 cents. So per 100 cows, it's $35 a day. So per 365 days, or if you're looking at a year, it's about $12,775 worth of savings. A typical 100 cow dairy herd is going to have anywhere from 80 to 100 acres of alfalfa, depending, maybe some are 50, depending on what their diet is. But still at that, it's about a 10 to 1 return on investment. If you back figure Invita ballparking anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 for, depending on your acres, for that application. So this is the big thing with this trial. So his data kind of mimicked, or is the same as it's right parallel with what we found in our sampling that we did. And this is one thing that I've had a lot of testimonials from guys that I sell it to, that other dealers sell it to, that we work with on the seed side. A lot of guys are seeing a milk increase as well. And we've seen that also when we do our testing. You see the milk increase in the milk per ton on the samples too. So so what he found is they picked up 3 pounds of milk per head per day. And I know milk prices have come up a little bit since then now, but I figured this on a 1550 hundredweight price. So that 3 pounds per head per day is an additional 47 cents per head per day, in essentially additional revenue. So if you add I should say, so if you add that together with the 35 cents in savings, total revenue we're looking at, it's about $82 per essentially 100 cows per day. So extrapolate that out per year, it's about $29,930 there for a $1,200. If you want to say 80 acres, retail at ballpark $600, napkin math here, but we're looking at about a 20-to-1 return on investment. So extremely, extremely high results. And the one thing I want to stress, if you just remember back to those graphs we just looked at, there's not a single graph where I have not seen, or a single test, excuse me, where I have not seen that return. There's always, even if it's a 0.7, 0.9, 1.1, yes, those numbers are not as high as 3.3, but the break even on it's about a 0.27 increase in protein. It just with the way that soybean meal or protein substitutes, with the current price of what they're at. So and I know and nothing in biologicals, and we talk about this all the time. There's nothing that is a guaranteed 100%. I know there's samples out there. We're going to have an instance where something happens where it doesn't work. But in terms of success and percentage of positive response, this is by far the highest return crop that we've seen with Envita. So.
Yeah, definitely. And Jake, those are some pretty big numbers. Pretty
Yeah.
impressive. Can you,
Yep. And
a question? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and the numbers do look, and a lot of guys are like, well, man, that almost looks too good to be true. The thing and the confidence that I've got in it is also with Legend, so I'm an agronomist per se, but I also do have a dealer network that I work with. Some guys that are my neighbors, the areas I grew up, dealers that I've worked with for quite a while. On farm, testimonials, what I've heard, truth checks the data that I'm pulling at the same time, and the guys that I'm selling it to over the top, yes, we do. They're not in that data set, but it mirrors that data perfectly. So not only do I have the Forage test in my hand and I'm like, yes, look at this data, this is good. It's actually going through the cows and I'm hearing it back from real world guys that are using it on 1,000 acres alfalfa and seeing the exact same thing. So it's not a shot in the dark of, oh, we're going to pull hand samples and then by the time it hits the cow, it's not going to be there. I've tested it I've tested hand cuttings wet. I've tested it after it's been cut. I've tested it once it's been chopped right at the bunk, and I've tested it after it's been fermented. And it comes back the same every time. We're not getting it shows up in an NIR and then once it hits the bunk, it disappears. It's not that kind of product per se. So it's feeding just as good as it tests. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we do have some third-party data as well, right, to support what
Yes.
we're seeing.
Yep. So Utah State University did a trial, I believe it was 3 years ago. And you can go right on, if you go on Google and just type in Utah State University Envita, that trial will pop right up. So what they did is they had it replicated on some different fall dormancies, different cutting schedules, kind of replicated data. And all that Yieldmaster did was supplied them with the Envita. And so what they found was they saw a 1.4% increase on protein, and they picked up 1/10 of a ton of dry matter. So, and that even at 1.4% protein increase, we're still at about a 5-to-1 return on investment. So like I said, there's always those cases where it's not going to be, that, like I said, there's those outliers of 8, 6, 7, those are in there. But even at a 1.4, it's still a very high return on investment currently. Soybean meal prices would have to fall an awful lot before that wouldn't be a return on investment. I don't think that price is going to go anywhere. So.
Yeah, well, and needless to say, after everything that Jake shared, third-party data, the number of years that we've been working with this product, as you can see, we have a very high amount of confidence when it comes to Envita and alfalfa as well as other crops. But to share in that confidence, we are offering a performance guarantee specifically on alfalfa. So with the purchase of a minimum of 160 acres, which is one case of Envita, we would like to see a check strip, 5 acres or 10% of the field, whichever is greater. And with every one of those cases that are purchased, you're going to get 2 sample bags with those cases. So we would like to collect treated and untreated, have them sent into Dairyland Labs. And if those results don't show, or they show less than a 0.5% increase in crude protein or less than a 10-point increase in relative feed value, you're going to get the product replaced next year at no cost to you. So we're really trying to demonstrate our confidence in alfalfa and in Vita. So again, if you don't see that 0.5% increase in crude protein, and you don't see a 10-point increase in relative feed value, you're going to get the Envita product to try again for free the following year. So we'll have full details. We'll get that out to the dealer network and into grower hands and whatnot. But really excited to share the performance guarantee and for you to see some of these results that Jake shared with you on your own with your own alfalfa acres. So thank you so very much for joining us. We know it's a busy time of year, but we were really excited to share this information. Hopefully you found it extremely valuable and exciting. And, we'll stick around here and answer any questions that you might have. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to Yieldmaster Solutions, and we're happy to answer any questions you have.